Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Enhance International's third in a series of webinars with our featured partners from scmBOX, Chris White, and the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium, Greg Schlegel. And today we're focused on strategic risk structural simulation, managing supplier financial distress through multiple tiers of your supplier network. We appreciate you taking the time today, and we look forward to your feedback throughout the webinar. Please feel free to enter into the chat and participate in our poll EV. The poll EV invitation is in the chat, so please link into that, please. This is the third of the series of webinars. We've had the first webinar that was just providing an overview on this topic of strategic risk simulation, and that was in April. And our last one was about reshoring from China, which is hot topic of many companies, of bringing the suppliers closer to the OEMs. And today we're going to talk about, well, what's the health of those suppliers? And we know that going through the pandemic and the different issues from that perspective, a lot of small, medium-sized companies are going out of business. Well, how do you detect that ahead of time so that you're not caught blindsided with losing a supplier? And so that's what we're talking about today. Next webinar in August, we'll talk about civil conflict minerals. That's on the way upstream in the supply chain. And of course, we depend on a lot of these rare earths for our supply to make many goods. And so we'll talk about that, being able to model that. And then we'll go into moving to India. We did moving to China. Now we're going to do one on moving to India. And then we're going to discuss the chip manufacturing transfer of the manufacturing facilities over the next 2 or 3 years and how that's going to affect different things. You can already see it in the stock market. So with that, the deliverables today are number one, our insights to the impact of supplier financial solvency. Then we'll get into the definition of the Altman Z, which is a very good predictor of financial health for companies. And then Chris will bring us through the modeling of using his supplier structural simulation model. And then we'll get into some action planning to address potential solvency disruptions. So overall, we're going to be able to model the impact of supplier solvency over time. Like I mentioned, we'll get into showing you some statistics on suppliers when we kick off the webinar. With that, Greg, a short overview.
You bet. Thanks a lot. Pleasure to be here with you. This is a quick picture of who we are and what we do at the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium. On the right-hand side, we have 3 pillars. We do a lot of education around the globe. In the middle, we do a lot of coaching and consulting. And on the right-hand side, we have several pretty large-scale supply software as a service supporting our supply chain risk and resiliency concepts. On the left, we have 5 product lines. We have 2 certificate courses. They're online, they're self-paced. One is basic supply chain risk and resiliency. The other is dedicated towards public healthcare and NGOs. We have 2 online assessment tools. One is called Supply Chain Management Readiness Assessment. That evaluates your supply chain process maturity and inherent risk. We'll talk about that today. The other one is a little newer. That's prescriptive online supply chain risk and resiliency. That gets into taking a look at your maturity, your risk appetite, and your risk culture. And it uses a lot of AI, ML algorithms to produce real quick graphs. We coach, we consult, we lead, guide, direct, and coach companies on their journey. And again, we have a host of platform solutions that support supply chain risk and resiliency. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Hey, thanks, Greg. And so scmBOX, I'm not going to get into a lot because you'll actually see it in action in the case study, the examples we're about to bring up. But scmBOX, Supply Chain Management Blocks, is a structural simulation tool that looks at the structure of a supply chain and is able to simulate that top to bottom down to tier N to understand how changes as each supplier adjusts and make changes throughout that whole entire supply chain, how those ripple and affect everyone else. If there's a disruption here, what does that mean to the other side of the supply chain? So we'll look at things like that with scmBOX. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And just a brief overview of Enhanced International Group. We're a group of about 50 to 60 consultants, consulting companies, and SaaS solution providers. And we lead with thought leadership while democratizing the technology that's out there. And we serve as that master integrator for you, the customer, to get the best and brightest companies and experience, and to help you in your making decisions to transform your company. We cover people, process, data, and technology. So we really cover the whole gamut of solutions. You see the bicycle slide here of strategy and execution. We have partners that focus on each area of this. Of course, today we're going to be focusing on supply chain risk and resiliency and linking simulation to action. The way I look at it is very often we have these risk event surprises out there, and we may be sitting, our executives may be sitting around the room and say, well, that will never happen again. What's the impact of that? How to prevent that? And this tool is a fantastic tool that Chris has developed over the last 20 years to help you do those what if scenarios so you can be more proactive. So it really links well into supply chain risk and resiliency with a consortium. The agenda today, again, is to focus on supplier financial solvency challenges. And then we'll get into the definitions. Greg will bring us through that. And then Chris will bring us through the modeling through end-year financial distress scenarios. Greg will show us a case study of a company that did go through distress and what it could look like if you were tracking it. Then we'll get into the recommendations on how to find that end-tier nexus supplier that could have the greatest impact to your production revenue. And then how do you get started? Where do you go from here? So with that, we'll get into the challenges out there. Of course, the biggest challenge out there is cash flow. Cash is king, especially when things get tough. Ensuring a steady cash flow is critical. Delays in receiving payments from customers can create liquidity challenges, impacting the ability to cover operational expenses and invest in growth. So that is the number one challenge here. The second is debt management, is managing the debt levels and securing new financing at favorable terms, especially today with the high interest rates. Of course, interest rates are looking favorable. They're coming down, but with the debt levels, that can be a real challenge. Credit worthiness, keeping your credit scores very positive and good are absolutely essential for your ability to borrow. A poor credit rating can limit access to necessary capital and increase your borrowing costs. Then from profitability pressures, maintaining and profitability amid fluctuating costs and competitive pressures is a significant challenge also. And suppliers need to manage their margins effectively to make sure that they are sure that long-term solvency. And then finally, risk management, near and dear to our heart, identifying and mitigating risks is essential, including related to market volatility, economic downturn, and currency fluctuations. In today's world, this is the way we live. So, Greg, any comments on any of these?
You bet. If it's not obvious, folk, there's enough risk around the globe to keep us all busy and vigilant. What bothers me is the amount of debt, the creditworthiness, and the geopolitical risk. That's what bothers me the most, folks. So just wanted to give you my opinion.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, from my side, further down the list, the number 4 and 5, the profitability pressures and the risk management, those are some of the exact things that we're looking at with some of the structural simulation is where are the biggest risks and how do these play into how much money you're making, you know, what your profitability is, both in the short term and the long term. So, yeah.
Great. So we thought, you know, from ChatGPT, these were the top 5. Something that's interesting is to watch, okay, well, how many bankruptcies are occurring? Are we having more bankruptcies than we had in the past? From a large cap perspective, where we had the 21, 22, those years, a reduction in bankruptcies. And last year was a return to the previous levels. And this year is on par to return from a large cap perspective. And this comes from S&P Global. I looked this the other day, yesterday, and I found this from Bankruptcy Watch, and this is all bankruptcies because the small and medium-sized companies are more negatively impacted due to this distress in the market. And for the first time in July, this is very current information that we have less bankruptcies than we did last year. So we were trending about a couple thousand higher than last year up until this point. As you can see, the blue line here versus the gray line in the dotted line. So bankruptcies have been going up year over year overall, driven by the small, medium-sized companies. But for the first time, you see a drop here in 2024. So is this an anomaly? Is this real? So this is something to watch closely in your supply chains on what's going on. Chris, Greg, any comments on this?
Yeah, from my perspective, these are the kinds of things that obviously can impact your supply chain. And so when we talk about supply chain risk, and what you'll see if you've seen some of our other webinars, the importance of having secondary suppliers to be able to shift if you're having issues with one. And this exact problem we'll look at coming up here in just a little bit.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, my comment is this is just the U.S. bankruptcy filings, folks. The consortium has partners globally, all around the world. What they tell us is it's just as bad, if not worse, in the EU. The rate of insolvency is up 30% over last year. According to Credit Form in the EU, insolvencies across all sectors for 2024 is far from over.
Yeah. The U.S. is probably leading in addressing this bankruptcy issue over the EU and other countries. Yes, absolutely. So gives you kind of a pulse. So in your particular area, to Greg's point, you need to be looking on where that is and break it down to say, you know, what type of markets how is your market faring? All markets are different. This is just on large caps, depending on where you are in the world. The types of companies that are getting hit are going to be different. And so those stats are readily available, and you should be looking at that within your supply chain. That's really the underlying message here. Thanks, Greg and Chris. With that, Greg?
Yeah, just a comment. It's from an industry point of view, to us, there's no sector that's immune going forward. So I just wanted to make a comment on that. So, yep. All right. If you want to talk a little bit about financial health definition and best practices, we have a few tidbits for you. First is we spend a moment on what we feel is a supplier financial best practice. It's called the Altman Z-score. It's been around for 40 years, folks. What is it? It's a series of weighted ratios for public and private firms. We're going to talk about public today. It has actually a greater than 90% accuracy rate in terms of predicting bankruptcy 1 year, 12 to 15 months into the future. And it's got about a 75% accuracy rate predicting bankruptcy 2 years in advance. So what's it made up of? 2 attributes. There's only 4 or 5 ratios. We'll show you an algorithm in a minute, but it provides a single score with kind of a green, yellow, and red status. So folks, it's a financial heat map, and the beauty is it's free. You can find it in Wikipedia, Investopedia. It's been out there for 40 years. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more about what it looks like. This is for publicly held companies. There's one for public and private. This is for public. What does the algorithm look like in the middle? All right, you can see the ratios, and then it also encompasses calculations from balance sheet and income statement that we all learn about in Finance 101. All right, so you can take a look at all the basic balance sheet and income statement calculations. The net, folks, is the score on the bottom left. When your Z-score is less than 1.8 for any supplier, any company, it's kind of in the red zone. There's a high likelihood of bankruptcy. A score between 1.8 and 3, that's the yellow zone. You got some risk there. You should be aware. If your Z-score is greater than 3, you're in the green zone, and that company is pretty financially sound according to the calculation. And so the private company, basically, the ratios are a little different because they have to report out their finances a little bit different. But we wanted to just share with you and provide you the calculation for publicly held. We said we'd show you a little bit of a use case. Busy slide, very colorful. Here, this is a use case from our consortium member company called Rapid Ratings. They're a forensic accounting firm based in New York City. They've been around almost as long as the consortium. They're a longstanding member. This profiles their FHR, their financial health report that they provide to their subscribers. It's by industry and it's by quarter, and it uses the Altman Z-score along with many other exogenous data points that they pull in. On the y-axis on the left is a picture of all the sectors. All right, on the top is the legend, the color legend from left to right, which you see red is very high risk, all the way down to blue on the top there, which is very low risk. And so essentially, they go by quarter. This is a picture image of what they were looking at over the years from 2013 to 2017 by quarter, and then by industry sector, and then it's color coded. So again, this methodology is a financial heat map over time. All right. So the net, when you look at it, we highlighted oil and gas producers just for the sake of explanation, and you can see from 2013 through 2016, that industry, according to Rapid Ratings, went from green to orange to red for a myriad of reasons, but it's a way of identifying, or at least getting a temperature check on an industry and or a company. So the net on the bottom is, what is the benefit you get if you do it yourself? It's time, folks. Time is money. It provides you potentially 12 to 18 months of time to secure an alternative supplier or a relationship. And so we just wanted to share that with you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. Pretty interesting. With that, we'll move into the modeling. And as last time, we'll start off by, if you would go to thepollev.com and enter in areas that you would like to see. We did use what we learned last meeting. So if you would continue entering in the areas that you would like to see modeled, please do that. It's kind of cumulative of our previous webinars, and we'll revisit this at the end of this section. With that, I'll hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Jim. So if you've seen some of the previous webinars, you've seen this slide, but the purpose of this slide is to show you that we are working at this, what we're doing right now with these structural simulations is at this intersection of looking at the strategic view, we talk about the risk paradox, that we don't spend much time looking strategically long-term, where we actually there's the biggest impact. I think the data says 6% of our time is spent on this that represents 86% of our total financial impact. So we've got a strategic focus. It's that perspective of strategic versus tactical versus operational, and all of the supply chain management readiness assessment information. And then we're going to use simulation to be able to do this. And actually, this is the first time we're going to talk about this, of how that simulation is done. And all this is, again, trying to help us de-risk what we're doing in our supply chain. So I mentioned that this simulation is going to be different. This is the first time you're going to see us explaining some of what the simulation approach is. And if you think of any kind of modeling that we do to look towards the future, there's basically two types. There's statistical modeling, and then there's structural modeling. And if we have this picture of a system or a process or whatever, you've got inputs that now we've got all these activities and we create these results. And statistical modeling, statistical forecasting looks at results. It looks at data, is all that it looks at. It treats the activities themselves as a black box. So we're very dependent on data. We're only looking at that. Sometimes we may be able to correlate to some input information, and so you're doing some of that. But the biggest thing is it treats the activities as a black box. It doesn't care what was done or how it was done. We just care about the data, and we're going to use that. Now, what's interesting is if you don't have data, you can't create a model. So statistical modeling is not good at understanding what happens in situations where we've never seen it before and we have no data. The other side is structural modeling, and that's what we do with scmBOX. And structural modeling peels back the curtain on those activities, and that's what it builds. It builds all the cause and effect, causal relationships, and it looks at how these play out over time. So you actually don't need data. The model itself is completely independent of the data. Data helps you tailor the model and calibrate it, but you don't need data to build the model itself. Again, the focus is on the activities. And so when we kind of look at how these two play out over time, what you see is as you forecast, kind of moving left to right, this is, the time and some fictitious results. I've got past results, and here I am making a decision. You see the decision point. And the thing is I'm making a statistical forecast. Generally, any of the tools you use right now, ERP systems, SCMs, are using some sort of demand forecasting that's based on historical data and projecting that forward. That little window of time right there, the momentum of all the activities in the system really prevent much from changing right there. So what's most important is, as you play out over the long term, what are the differences? And I've shown an example here, which is based on real life. I've seen this personally. And when you're looking just at this little forecast window that's really short term, everything kind of looks okay, but long term, huge difference. One's going up, one's going down. And so this is where structural forecasting comes into play. So kind of pros and cons. If you look at statistical modeling, the pros of that are that it can be used for short term. Great, because the conditions really don't change that much in the short term. So in reality, almost any forecast methodology, it works. And it's already built into ERP and SCM tools. So, that's one of the good things. The cons, the bad things are that it often requires, you need perfect data. And so you're scrubbing data, you're cleansing data, you may be even fudging data at times to make sure that it works. Statistical modeling is not good for the long term, especially when the conditions change and you have no data for that condition. And so you have no way to understand or build a model. And it doesn't include any of sort of the decision-making processes along the way. So if I see some value going up, as a manager, I may make some adjustments to correct that number. None of that is included because, again, statistical modeling treats all the activities as a black box, doesn't really care. Structural modeling, pros and cons for that. The pros are it does incorporate all those cause and effect activities and management feedback loops of how things are corrected. And it is better for long-term forecasts, more accurate than statistical modeling. Some of the cons are that it doesn't really, in the short term, doesn't really do anything different. So statistical, structural doesn't really matter. Statistical is just as good. And it's not included in any of the tools right now, which is how and why we created scmBOX. So, Jim, I think you've got a couple of comments to make.
Yeah, so we were researching and we found this paper made between Michigan State University and Iowa, the Spartans and the Iowa Huskers, Hawkeyes, I should say. And what was interesting in this is it's a very good paper, but that you can look up. You probably could just search it up on the web and pull this down. But it's building on a theory of nexus suppliers from Yon in 2015. They identified key suppliers located deep within that supplier network, and several examples on that on a single disruption point can cause a large scale cascading disruption. So the definition on the right-hand side, you see that definition of a nexus supplier is a supplier within a multi-tiered supplier network that significantly influences a buyer's performance because of their strategic position. So taking all that into account, what they found was, and this is a bunch of academic words, they found that the modular structures have heterogeneous effect of cascading disruptions, while modular structures constrain disruptions from spreading extensively. They intensify the impact on a few suppliers, resulting in a higher severity in terms of service level reduction. So what we want to do in this model is confirm that we're able to emulate what they've found in this paper. And so with that, I'm going to ask Greg to also provide some comments on this from another perspective. Greg?
Yeah, sure. We thought it was a very interesting concept, something that's not really been delved into from an academic point of view. Pretty comprehensive approach and a great study because what interests us over the last 15 years is cascading disruptions still keep the exemplar risk companies, the companies who are doing everything in our book, everything we advocate, and they are very, very mature in their supply chain risk and resiliency approach. Cascading disruptions in their supply chain still keeps them up at night. So we thought this is very, very interesting, a very quantitative and qualitative approach to this cascading effect. We would advocate you take a look at their approach, and we wanted to share the comments with you.
Great, Greg. And take it away, Chris.
All right, so what we've done, if you've seen some of the other webinars, we're going to build on the same basic model that we've done previously, and we're going to use it and put some what-if scenarios in there. to begin to test what we saw in that paper. So this is the basic setup. Any entity in this model will look like this. If you look at the bottom graphic, it really captures it. They're producing something. So they receive some material, they've got raw materials, they're trying to hold 4 weeks worth of raw materials. Then they move that into production and they create finished goods, 4 weeks of finished goods, and then they make delivery. So this is kind of a real simple view of it. The level, we're looking at 100 orders a week. We're going to do a 2-year simulation. So all that's the same. This is representing only one SKU within a company. So this, just because this SKU goes out or has trouble doesn't mean the whole company does. And there's no waste, just for simplicity. So perfect yield, everything's done. And so, and there's basic inventory control loops in there that are sort of moderate in terms of how they respond to changes in inventory. So if we now lay this out, so that's what each entity looks like. And this is kind of a map of what the supply chain looks like. We've got an OEM that has a tier 1 supplier. That tier 1 supplier has 3 tier 2 suppliers that are all supplying different components. So these are not 3 redundant suppliers. They're all supplying something different. I need each of these 3 components to build my tier 1 that goes to the OEM. So that kind of gives you the structure of it. And this is based on what we did before. So when we look geographically at what this model represents, it's exactly from what we did in the last webinar, which is that we've got the OEM is sitting in the United States. We've got our tier 1. If you recall, we were doing the reshoring the last time. And so that tier 1 is in the United States. The 3 tier 2s, there's one in Mexico, there's one in Africa, and there's one still in China. And the white numbers on each of these lines, we're going to see that they play a role, but those are the shipping times, we're going to say. So within the United States, it's short, within a week we're getting stuff. But from Mexico, it's 4 weeks. From Africa, it's 8 weeks. In China, it's 12 weeks. So sort of the further you are, the supplier is from the tier 1, the longer the transportation is, the transport is, obviously. So the scenarios we're going to walk through, and this is where the Altman Z comes in. We've got our baseline, which is the same baseline we've run before. So I'm going to kind of go through these quickly, the results quickly, because it's really just changing a few things each time. Scenario 1 is we're going to pretend that our Altman Z score has shown us that the tier 1 is having trouble. And so we're going to see, well, what if they really did have trouble, and for 2 months, due to finances trying to get their house in order, they quit shipping to us. They shut down this line particularly, and are trying to get things in order. So for 2 months, we don't get anything from our tier 1. And then we're going to walk through and just move that around and say, well, so what if it was our tier 2 that was in Mexico? And what if it was the tier 2 that was in Africa? What if it was the tier 2 in China? So it's like a scientific experiment, and that's what we can do with scmBOX, is just say, what if it happens here, all things being equal, what's the result? What if it happens here, all things being equal? And so these are each one just shutting down. So if we take a look at the baseline, I'm going to kind of reset everything. The baseline is steady state. You see the deliveries at 100. We're holding 4 weeks of inventory in raw material and finished goods. So we see 400. So this is a nice steady state. Of course, real life isn't truly steady state, but fluctuations of a few percent are no big deal. And so we're roughly steady state. If we put this in a table, because now we're going to have some way to compare all of these. In our example with all the pricing, and again, all the things are the same in each scenario. In the end, we have a little over 120,000 cash available. So we're building. We started at 100,000. We're building over the 2 years. In the baseline, everything's smooth, so I don't have to recover. I don't have spikes or anything like that. And the lead time is a week, which we saw on that previous slide. Everything's delivered on time, and our minimum profit margin, in fact, our steady state profit margin, is 20%. So we never dip below that. So now let's look at scenario 1. And in scenario 1, we're going to knock out the tier 1 supplier for 2 months, assume that the Altman Z score has told us that they're going to have some financial issues, and we're going to see that impact on us, the OEM. So in all of this, when I say us, we are that black box up there, we're the OEM. So our tier 1 goes out. So if we look at the results, what you see, again, this is the same chart you were looking at, same 3 variables, finished goods, raw materials, delivery. What you see is they all dip when that we're steady state, we hit that disruption, everything dips. You'll notice finished goods takes a little longer. Raw material dips and then finished goods takes a while, but that's because all that, the 4 weeks of inventory that were in raw material can still move through. We're just not getting any more raw material. So eventually we can't create anything, which means eventually we can't deliver. And then when that supplier comes back online, of course, they have a big backlog of orders. So they're suddenly, because the whole time we're trying to order from them, all this comes back. So we see a spike in raw materials, and then it kind of begins to settle down, and we see finished goods get back up. And by the end, even though raw material is adjusting, we are back at our 4 weeks worth of finished goods, and our deliveries are back on order. For a while, we had to over deliver to make up, and now we're back to deliver. So if we look at the table now associated with that, in the end, if our U.S. Tier 1 goes out for 2 months or is offline for 2 months due to finances, our cash is much lower. We've lost, compared to the 120, we're down to 44,000. It takes us 13 weeks to get to 50% of what we were delivering. So we want 100. It took us 13 weeks to get to be able to deliver at least 50 at that point in time. It takes us another couple of weeks, 15 weeks total, to finally get back up to doing at least that 100%. And again, we kind of overshoot for a while. There's some spikes in raw material. We have a maximum of plus 165%. So that's quite a bit. And then minus 100%, we go to zero, to where we don't have any. Finished goods never over spikes, but of course it goes to zero. And you don't see it, but in the background, we've got a spike in orders because our customers are still ordering, and we get up as high as over 1,000%, 1,200%. Our longest lead time is now 14 weeks. So at the worst part, we're taking 14 weeks to deliver. We can only have 71% on-time deliveries. And remember, that includes this whole beginning steady state period where we were delivering. So during that adjustment period, we're very low, and we finally get back on to where we're delivering back on time. And our minimum profit margins, it basically goes to negative infinity. It's bad. It's bad. So, it just tanks. So if we now look at the second scenario, we're going to take our Tier 2 that's in Mexico. We're going to pretend like they have financial trouble for 2 months, and we're going to see what those results are. So now if we're going to look at the same charts and table as we did before. Now you can see that our raw materials, and again, this is us. These are charts for us. This is not the chart for the Tier 2 supplier. This is our chart. So our raw material dips doesn't really go to zero. You never see it bottom out. Same with finished goods, same with deliveries. And the period that we're impacted is a little bit shorter. And you'll notice those oscillations, because the scale is the same on this chart. Those oscillations in raw material are not as bad as they were. So if we now come to the table, and I'm going to go through these quickly because you kind of have the setup, we'll see financially we're better than if our Tier 1 went out of business. Not went out of business, suffered for a couple of months. So we're in the end 109,000. It takes us 4 weeks to get back to the 50% level of deliveries. It takes us 6 weeks to get back to 100%. And now our spikes are a little bit less. So we only go up 75% in raw material and negative 99%. So we almost bottom out, but we don't quite. Same with finished goods. We never we never have a spike above, and we dip. We saw that dip, but again, does not get to zero. The highest orders backlog, because all of that is not as bad, we're only 345% above the initial number, so that's not too bad. Our longest lead time is 4.5 weeks. We're able to deliver 87% on time, and our minimum profit margin is negative 375%. That doesn't mean we stay there. That means at some point, based on the way, cost of raw materials, what we're delivering, all that, we hit that. So it's bad, but not as bad as the Tier 1. So now if we go to scenario 3, we're going to do this exact same thing, except our supplier in Africa goes out. So now if we look at those results, we're going to look at the same graphs. A little less bad. We see dips, and they don't look as bad. The finished goods, the deliveries, you can see just for a little period of time, we are short, and then we're back to normal. Our raw materials, you see, oscillate, but by the end, we're actually back on track. So what does that mean in the summary table? So our overall financial impact, the cash available is almost what we have in the baseline. The amount of time to get to 50% of our delivery shrinks to 2 weeks. 100% is now just 3 weeks. We still see a big spike in raw material, but it's not. You'll see negative 96%. It drops, but not, still bad, but not as bad as if it was our Mexican supplier. And then you see finished goods again never goes over and goes to negative 83%. Our highest backlog in orders is only 68% high. Our longest lead time is 2 weeks now, and we're able to deliver 93% with a minimum profit margin. The worst we ever are is negative 11%. So, it's actually better than the scenario 2. So now if we go to scenario 4, that's taken, so we're doing the exact same thing again, taking our tier 2 that's in China, and we're going to pretend like the Altman Z-score has indicated they may have trouble. And so we're going to say that financially for 2 months, they're not able to deliver to us, and we're going to see what happens. So now when we look at those results, you'll see actually the deliveries never adjust. We never miss any deliveries. Again, this is our chart, not the chart for the results at the tier 2. This is ours. You'll see a dip in raw materials, not as bad. You'll see a dip in finished goods, not near as bad. And raw materials again settles back down. So not all that bad. And when we look at the final chart, the total summary chart, what's interesting is it's almost very close to the baseline. According to this, we actually make slightly more money. So, roughly the same as the baseline. We don't ever suffer with deliveries. All those deliveries, you saw that straight line, we're able to maintain, even though our raw material and finished goods adjust a little bit, we are never hurt. They never adjust so much that we can't deliver. So we're able to deliver. We do still see a spike in the raw material, but it doesn't drop near as much. Same with the finished goods. The negative is only negative 48%. We don't experience a backlog in orders because we're delivering all the time. We still have a 1 week lead time, make all our deliveries on time. We do, thanks to all that fluctuation. At one point, we've got a negative 8% profit margin. So this is very interesting when you see this in chart form, but I want to lay out the comparisons of all of them. So here are all 5 scenarios, baseline, 1, 2, 3, 4, all on one chart. And it's just interesting to kind of see the trend. So the baseline is we're now looking at raw material, which again starts at 400 and the baseline stays at 400. And you can see scenario 1, the red dash line, we immediately drop, we flatten, we bottom out. And then we start moving, and you see scenarios 2, 3, and 4 in that order kind of start to drop, but not as bad. And you see their oscillations come back not as bad as scenario 1. And what's interesting is you begin to see that the closer the disruption, the closer the financial issue, if they shut down for 2 months to improve finances, the closer that is to us in terms of tiers of the supply chain, the worse the impact, which is what that paper was saying. So we see that right here. And then what we begin to see is that, and right here on finished goods, the same thing. We see a dip for scenario 1 that goes all the way down, flattens out, and the other ones become less and less and less. But you're also noticing that scenarios 2, 3, and 4 are in order. And that's because there's these longer pipelines. So the Mexico supplier is 4 weeks delivery. African supplier is 8 weeks. Chinese supplier is 12 weeks. And what we're seeing are those 4 week, each one buys us a little bit of time. And it's interesting because it buys us that time, it actually begins to create a buffer. And so the further away, not only in the tier, but geographically in terms of transportation, there's a lot of inventory in that pipeline. And so that's a bit of a buffer in protecting us. So if we keep looking at the other ones, we now see this is the delivery. And again, baseline is 100 and scenario 4 is 100, never dips. The other ones dip, and you can see them, to lesser and lesser extents. But now let's take a look at some of the finances. This is difficult to read, I agree, but these are the oscillations in the profit margin for each of them. Baseline stays at 20% the whole time. The scenario 1 takes a huge dip. You see that red dash line going down, and then it tries to make its way back up. And by the end, it's still sitting at negative 60. It's not coming back yet because it's still all these oscillations are throwing things off. Scenario 2 dips, but not as bad. And of course, we're not going down. That'd be a huge chart to be able to capture all that. The blue dotted line, scenario 3, is not as bad where it is. And same thing with scenario 4. The green dashed dot line is not as bad. And so you can kind of see those. And the oscillations are due to the oscillations in inventory. And so when you calculate, if I have excess inventory and I'm not selling or delivering as much, then that makes it look worse. And so we see some of that oscillations in profit margin simply due to the oscillations in inventories. And here it is now when we look at the total finances. Baseline, is just growing. Scenario 1, we're losing money. So remember, we started at 100. So it's not like we made 44,000. We actually lost, 55,000 in this thing. And it doesn't look like it's turned around yet for scenario 1. Scenario 2, closer to that gray line, we're up to 109. Scenario 3, 120. So the baseline, scenario 3, and scenario 4 all kind of lay, roughly the same. So it's very interesting when you lay it out like this and you see the cascading effect, and we're mimicking and we're capturing and validating what was said in that paper, that the further away the disruption or change in the situation or change in the supplier, the further away that is in terms of death in the tiers of supply chain. And we're showing here even geographically, the further away, because further away means kind of proportionally a longer transportation time. Further away, all of that results in less cascading to the OEM, me in this example. And so the further away the disruption, the less impact it has on me. Now, if we were to go look at the charts for each of those suppliers, we'd see that they were horrible. They experienced, major trouble. And that's also what the paper says, is that the further away you are, you're not as impacted. But those that are impacted are really, really, really impacted heavily. And so we're showing some of that right here. So very interesting example in my mind.
Thanks, Chris. Fascinating case study. I just asked Chris and Greg to join, turning on their cameras here to talk about what events you would like to see in the future. These are some of the things that we've talked about in the past, the chips.
Chips.
India. A lot of folks are talking about the battery supply chain, which would be a very interesting.
That material. Yep.
That would be a very interesting one. And of course, Greg, your thoughts?
As we mentioned, there's enough risk out there in the globe in supply chain to keep us all busy and to be vigilant. So thank you. Thanks for participating.
Yeah, thanks for your thoughts, and feel free to email us on what you would like to see in the future. We're always looking for ideas. So thank you for your participation. And with that, we'll move to the next section. Greg will bring us through on a case study. Greg?
Yep, you bet. We wanted to share with you a real case study with a company coming out of our member Rapid Ratings. So they've been tracking this company since basically 2016, 2017, like they do for many of the industries and companies that ask them to evaluate other financial health. This is CASA Systems. Net, they were, according to Rapid Ratings, they're high default risk with what they call very poor core health. And you can see on the right-hand side that the Rapid Ratings was identifying and trending the financial health rating, if you will, over the last couple of years. And you can see it drop on the y-axis is their financial health rating from 0 to 100. 0 is bad, 100 is good. Basically, this company went, if you look at the chart left to right, they went from being green to yellow to orange and then to red over the last couple of years. Their view on CASA Systems their financial rating went to about 21, where 0 is the worst, 100's the best, over the 4 quarters ending September 30, 2023. Their rating, that rating of a 21, according to Rapid Ratings, lowers the company into the bottom half or quartile of a high-risk group, and they estimated the probability at that time of bankruptcy at almost 10%. There's more. We'll take you through a couple more examples that Rapid Ratings shared with us. On CASA on the left-hand side, again, we'll give you a timestamp here, September of 2023. They released their report on November 2023. It's electronics, semiconductors. The financial health rating was 21. That's very high. You can see over on the right-hand side the key data and the ratios. Just wanted to give you 3 of them. The top one there, financial health rating, you can see it went from yellow to orange and then orange to red, actually. Another rating in the middle is operating profit. You can see how that degraded over time. And then finally, the bottom return, ROCE, return on capital employed, that went from a positive to a huge negative. And we got one more slide to share with you. And that is kind of their definition of their core health score. It's a measure of the medium-term sustainability, according to them, based on operational efficiency and competitiveness. So you can take a look at the quadrant over there on the right-hand side. On the y-axis of the quadrant is their core health, and you can see the numbers, the ratings. And then on the top x-axis is the default rate in terms of very high on the left to very low on the right. And then you can see the 4 quadrants. At this point in time, they said CASA was in quadrant C, which is core health, very poor, and a high risk. And anybody in that quadrant, according to them, basically is a very high risk of default over the following year. And the net, before I turn it over to Jim, the net, where are they now? Just to give you some context, CASA was delisted from the NASDAQ in 2023. They filed for Chapter 11. They had a court-approved sale of their business. They were acquired by Lumine Group, all right, back in 2023. They had a CEO transition back in 2022. That's what happens. And their stock price at the moment is almost 0. So just wanted to give you some context on how the Altman Z-score and how Rapid Ratings leverages the Altman Z-score in time. And I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. That's a nice case study there to show how this can really help you by participating in the Altman Z and financial health of your company and your suppliers. And it can even work for your customers, of course. Now we're going to get into the recommendations on how to find that N-tier Nexus supplier with the greatest impact. So, you know, after all this, I think we thought we'd wrap it up in a moral of the story kind of slide and saying, you know, well, the closer the disruption in your supply chain to your, you know, from a tier level, the greater the impact. I think that's the first lesson. And then, time, you know, the time to delivery is that buffer that you have in your tier N suppliers. So the further they're away, that buffer actually somewhat aids in minimizing the impact of losing that supplier for some period of time. So if you're just a purist and you're looking at the P&L, you may miss all of this, and companies often do. So making inventory level decisions based purely on standard financial P&L metrics often leads to making the supply chain actually more brittle and fragile. So we see this all the time, Greg and I, for the last 20 years. We see companies making this mistake. And we really are attached to this paper because I think this is the first good explanation of this, using Chris's modeling tool and referencing the Nexus supplier. Greg, your thoughts?
You bet. On the bottom, folks, balancing efficiency versus resiliency. There is a huge, difficult set of discussions going on right now across all industries in the C-suite in terms of discussing supply chain efficiency, which is really get cost out, which we've been doing for 40 years, versus resiliency, which is really effectiveness. So that is going on across all C-suites right now. Just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, and
And
I'd
I'd
say
like to,
it's
I'd
it's a
like to
better
add,
discussion today than it has been 10 years ago. At least we're talking about it, Greg. 10
yeah,
years ago, we wouldn't even talk about it. But Chris, go
Nope.
ahead. Sorry.
yeah, I was going to add, there is a balance there. You cannot have both. So they are two ends of a spectrum. I'm either highly efficient, which makes me brittle, and I'm only highly efficient and cost effective in this scenario, under these specific conditions. As soon as those change, I'm having trouble. The other end of this spectrum is the resiliency or the responsiveness, which often requires redundant suppliers, extra inventory. So it's not the most cost effective, but it is the most long-term survivability effective method. And so it's a spectrum, and you're balancing on that. And sometimes you may tip a little more towards kind of optimizing costs, and at times you may tip a little more towards the resiliency and responsiveness in. But the point is, we have got to get out of this efficiency end of the spectrum and begin to lift up, pick our heads up, look longer term, look at things other than just cost, because we have seen where that has gotten us.
Greg, the last word.
Nope, ditto.
Okay, good. All right. Just make sure we hit this full-heartedly. All right. Well, with that, uh, Chris?
Yeah. So just from this simulation, and again, trying to test out what that paper said and show that structurally, does this actually happen? And sure enough, it does. And the moral of the story here is that each supplier in your supply chain has a different impact on operations. And so what we just showed is with the exact same disruption or shutdown for 2 months due to finances, whatever it is, it could have been weather, it could have been, some political, change or something like whatever it is, that supplier is kind of offline for a while. But with that same disruption, we showed that each supplier has a different impact on me as the OEM in this particular case on my performance. And so that's very important, because now you can use that information. We said that Altman Z is free, and it is, the approach is free, but the data that you need often costs money to go get that data. The data is not always readily available. So rather than go try to pay and collect data for all the suppliers in your supply chain, what we've just shown is that you can actually, using a structural simulation approach like scmBOX, you can actually prioritize where to go collect data. So in our simple example, if I could only collect data for one supplier, it'd be my tier one, and I'd want to understand their financial situation through the Altman Z score, because they're the biggest impact on me. The others are less and less and less. And so if I could do two, then I'd pick my tier one and then the supplier in Mexico. So anyway, those begin to play out. And these are big picture risks that play out over time. You are not going to see these kinds of results with the network optimization tools, network design tools that are out there that can really only do short term, because they are more statistical in nature often, and or discrete event. They're not continuous and capture feedback and all that. So problems with there. But last, we've said this every time, in a supply chain, no company is an island. It is a system. They're all interconnected. That's how the buffering effect happens, is everyone's adjusting. And so if the disruption is further away from me in the tiers of the supply chain, every tier in between me and that disruption provides some buffer and makes it less for me. So it's very interesting, and decisions made in one area of the supply chain can obviously impact other areas. So just some of the conclusions from the simulation.
So how do we get started, Chris?
Well, as Greg talked about, the supply chain readiness assessment, or I think he's about to talk about this, is a great place to start to understand where in your supply chain you may have some issues. Then you're mapping your supply chain top to bottom. If you don't have a starting point, usually the supply chain mirrors the bill of material. And so if you know what you're building and it has components, I guarantee there's probably a supplier supplying those components. And so you could easily create that. There are tools out there that do some of that mapping, but you want to understand that so that now you can begin to do these what if scenarios, like we just did. A disruption, doesn't matter what it is, shorter, longer supply times, redundant suppliers, whatever, transition from one supplier to another. These big strategic risks long term is what we want to look at. Then you create models like you just saw, and we can look top to bottom what happens. And now you can sort of look at those results and say, well, under these conditions, if I see this happening, I want to do A. If I see these other things happening, I want to do B. And so you kind of have this playbook of being able to understand as the environment starts to show you different things. There's different ways you can respond, and you've got a playbook of responses. I think Greg's going to talk about, here we go.
Yep, you bet. Thanks, Chris. We'll give you a real quick thumbnail sketch of supply chain management readiness assessment. As Chris mentioned, you can do this. You can get into the tool. It's essentially evaluating the outcome of the assessment is the chart that you see in the middle. It has 13 tenets. They're strategic, tactical, and operational in nature. What does it measure? It measures two things: your supply chain process maturity across those 13 tenets and your inherent risk within each one of those tenets. So therefore, the closer you are to the center of the graph, the more mature that process is and the less inherent risk you have. Subsequently, the farther away, you're less mature in that process and you have a higher inherent risk. So you can see the black line. The black line is the as is state in terms of answering the questions. That gives you a sense of where you are. The questions that that are posed at that come out of the example, the exercise are: where are you on the supply chain maturity model? What inherent risks? These are all discussion points that tend to come out once you do the analysis. Is your supply chain flexible, like we've talked about? Isn't it flexible enough to handle disruptions? These are automated reports. We always ask, how mature are your supply chain processes? And the beautiful part on the bottom is, folks, it's free. All right, you can go in there at any time. You can do it multiple times. You can do it individually or with a group like your team. The URL is in the red box. You can click on. It's free. We just wanted to provide this information to you as potentially a starting point to get the dialogue going in terms of supply chain risk and resiliency. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And as you saw in the modeling that Chris did, we chose a few metrics to track for this scenario. It's so important that you're benchmarking how you're performing today and what you can get out of making improvements. This particular table we review every webinar. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. We look at it from a revenue, top line margin perspective, looking at Gartner's benchmark metrics, some earnings before interest and taxes, depreciation and amortization, with Chainalytics on cost to serve is the metric we chose here, and return on net assets with Gartner. Of course, we want to have less inventory, and cash conversion cycle, and we have on time and in full OTIF. So I'm not going to go through all the gains for each one of those, from laggards to average, average to followers, and followers to leaders, but there's a lot to be gained. The beauty of Chris's scmBOX model is we can model this for you and tailor it to match your challenges that you will have, so that you can have these type of interesting and fortifying conversations with your executives on these type of risk events. Chris, any thoughts on this, or Greg?
Well, I love the horrifying, and a lot of this. What's interesting when you start getting into some of the structural simulation, if you go back to the chart, I mean, don't go back to the chart, but if you think back to the chart that I showed between the difference of statistical and structural simulation, and looking at the results over time, and how there can be this huge divergence over the longer term that statistical forecasting or statistical models cannot capture. And that a lot of that is actually counterintuitive. You know, Jim, when we were doing this, we talked about how we did not expect to see that the cascading effect of how far geographically or transportation wise the suppliers were. And so the farther away we realized, and I wouldn't have thought this, is that all that transportation, that's inventory. And so whether that inventory is sitting somewhere physically or it's in the pipeline, it protected me, the OEM. And so it's just very interesting. A lot of this stuff is counterintuitive. And so it does, when you say horrifying, sometimes there's some horrifying results because it's not what we would expect.
Yeah. We're trying to limit those surprises.
Yeah.
And the more we're attuned to that, the more we can move from just focusing on the P&L alone, the efficient versus the resilient, and trying to move to create that balance so that we can have those good conversations at the executive level. And I think that's very powerful about this tool. Greg,
exactly.
Any other thoughts on this?
Just kind of a recap, folks. Hope we provided you some salient statistics and insights in terms of how critical financial health is relative to your supply base. So all the best on your supply chain risk and resilience journey, and thanks for attending.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And with that, I'll just mention that we have hopefully we addressed your any of your deliverables, the deliverables of this, and if there's any outstanding questions, please let us know. And then our next webinar is on the civil conflict minerals, and way upstream there. So we look forward to you joining us on August 28th. And Chris, any closing comments?
No, it'll be interesting. In all the examples we've shown so far, we've only gone a tier 1, tier 2. And as we get into that next scenario, we're going to dig deeper to more tiers. And so you'll begin to see some of this, and again, structurally, how this whole supply chain responds as a system.
Thanks, Chris. Any other thoughts, Greg? Are you all set?
I'm all set. All the best, folks.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward. Enjoy your summer. And we look forward to catching up on end of August. All the best. Thank you.